He pulled an abandoned fire truck out of a forest lake that everyone thought had been lost for decades. When they opened the doors, what they saw made his legs go weak. Subscribe so you don't miss the continuation, and write in the comments which city you're watching from. For more than 20 years, Elias Monroe had started his mornings the same way, long before the sun had a chance to reach the lower valleys of the park. He rose in the dim half-light of his cabin, the air inside always cool no matter the season, carrying the faint resinous scent of pine that crept in through old wooden frames. He brewed coffee in a dented steel pot he had owned since his first year on the job, and drank it slowly while looking out at the wall of forest that pressed against the clearing like a silent audience. There was comfort in the repetition of his routine. It gave shape to days that otherwise dissolved into the endless rhythm of weather, wildlife, and visitors who never truly understood how alive the land was beneath their boots. Elias had spent more than 2 decades as a ranger in one of the most remote national parks in the northern part of the country, a place that did not appear on postcards and was rarely featured in travel magazines. The terrain was harsh, the winters long and brutal, and even in summer the mountains kept their secrets under layers of mist and shadow. The job was not glamorous, but Elias had never wanted glamour. He had come here as a young man fresh out of training, full of idealism and with a quiet determination to prove that he belonged in a profession where he often felt he had to work twice as hard to be seen as equal. Over the years, the park had become more than his workplace. It had become a living map of memories, every trail and ridge marked not just on charts, but inside him. That morning, he set out as he always did, taking his pickup along the narrow service road that curved like a ribbon between towering firs and granite outcroppings. He stopped to check a damaged sign near a trailhead where spring floods had undercut the post. He logged the coordinates in his notebook, noting the water level in the nearby creek and the condition of the bridge farther downstream. These were small tasks, but Elias knew that neglecting small things was how big problems began. He had seen it countless times, from unchecked erosion that turned a trickle into a landslide, to a forgotten gate that allowed off-roaders to carve scars into fragile meadows. As he drove deeper into the park, the landscape shifted subtly. The forest grew denser, the canopy closing in overhead until the sky was only a suggestion between branches. In this part of the park, the silence had weight. It pressed against the ears, broken only by the distant call of a hawk or the hollow knock of woodpeckers. Elias had learned to read that silence like language. When birds stopped singing abruptly, or when insects went quiet in the middle of the day, it usually meant that something larger was moving through the undergrowth. On that morning, however, the silence felt different. Not alert, but subdued, as if the land itself were holding its breath. His route eventually brought him to the access road that once led to the old Quarry Lake, a body of water that did not exist on the original maps of the park. Decades earlier, it had been a deep open pit carved into the mountainside by a mining company that vanished as suddenly as it had arrived. When the pumps were shut down and the machinery removed, groundwater slowly flooded the hollow, creating a lake so dark and deep that it swallowed light. The official trails avoided it, partly because of the treacherous slopes that ring the basin and partly because of the uneasy stories that clung to the place. Locals claimed that anything dropped into the lake was never seen again, not because of depth alone, but because of strange currents that seemed to pull objects into the silt like hands. Elias had passed the turnoff countless times, rarely stopping. There was no reason to go there in the course of ordinary patrols, and visitors seldom found it without directions. That day, however, He slowed as he approached the faded sign half hidden behind brush. Something in the air made him hesitate. The summer had been unusually hot, with weeks of relentless sun that cracked the soil and turned streams into ribbons of dust. The quarry lake had always been known for its stubbornly high water level, fed by underground springs, but reports from fishermen over the past few days suggested that the shoreline was receding. Elias had made a note to investigate, though he had not expected to feel the faint metallic tang in the air even before he turned off the road. He parked near the remains of an old concrete dock that jutted like a broken tooth into the water. The surface of the lake was lower than he remembered, exposing a ring of slick gray mud around the edges. On that muddy band, he noticed marks that did not belong to any animal he knew, deep parallel grooves that could only have been made by tires. They were old, almost filled in, but unmistakable. Kneeling near the water, he dipped a gloved finger into a thin film that shimmered in the sunlight. It left a faint rainbow on the surface before dissolving. The smell was unmistakable now, not the rot of vegetation or the mineral scent of stone, but something oily, something mechanical. The complaints that had come in over the past week replayed in his mind. A pair of hikers had mentioned a strange sheen on the water that stuck to their boots. A local angler had described a taste in the air that reminded him of old garages. Elias had brushed them off at first, assuming that a leaking boat engine or illegal dumping might be the cause. But standing there, alone on the crumbling dock with the dark lake yawning beneath him, he felt a ripple of unease that had nothing to do with the ordinary litter of careless visitors. As he walked along the newly exposed shoreline, he saw fragments half buried in the mud, twisted strips of metal and shards of rusted bolts that crumbled at his touch. These were not recent. They were relics, worn smooth by decades underwater. He photographed each one, logging their positions as he went, his professional detachment masking a growing sense of curiosity. He had learned long ago that the land often whispered before it shouted, that subtle changes were its way of announcing deeper shifts beneath the surface. By the time he returned to his truck, the sun was climbing higher, burning off the last wisps of morning mist. Elias sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, staring at the tree line across the lake. Somewhere in the back of his mind, an old story stirred, one he had heard on his first winter in the park from a mechanic who had since retired. The story had been told as a kind of campfire legend about a fire engine that never made it back from a call in the mountains during the 1960s. Officially, it had been lost in a landslide, crushed beyond recovery. Unofficially, people said it had simply vanished, swallowed by the wilderness like so many other things. At the time, Elias had dismissed it as folklore, another exaggerated tale born from isolation and long winters. Now, with the smell of oil still clinging to his hands and the image of those tire tracks etched into his memory, the legend felt uncomfortably close. He pulled out his notebook and wrote a short report to his supervisor, careful to keep his tone neutral. He described the lower water level, the metallic odor, the film on the surface, and the old tracks. It was routine language, the kind he had used hundreds of times before, but as he closed the notebook he knew that he would not be able to treat this like just another entry in a long list of anomalies. Before leaving, he took one last look at the lake. The dark water lay still, reflecting the sky in a way that made it seem bottomless, and he had the sudden, irrational feeling that something beneath that mirror was waiting. Not for the drought to end or for the rains to return, but for someone to finally notice it. With that thought pressing against his mind, Elias started the engine and drove back toward the main road, unaware that this quiet morning had already begun to pull him into a story buried for more than half a century, one that the park itself seemed ready to give up at last. Elias Monroe did not sleep well that night. The image of the dark lake lingered behind his eyes long after he had turned off the lamp beside his bed, and when he finally drifted into a shallow, uneasy rest, he dreamed of standing on the crumbling concrete dock while the water below him receded, revealing shapes that had no place in a natural basin. By the time dawn arrived, pale and cool, he had already made up his mind that the inspection he had written up in dry, procedural language would not remain a formality. Something about the scene from the previous day had settled into his thoughts with the stubbornness of grit in a boot, and no amount of rational explanation could quite scrape it away. He began preparing for a more thorough survey of the quarry lake as soon as he arrived at the ranger station. The building was quiet. Most of his colleagues assigned to other districts are off duty, and the long hallway smelled faintly of old paper and pine cleaner. In the equipment room, he selected a portable sonar unit, a compact device designed for shallow water mapping that he normally used to locate submerged logs or abandoned fishing gear. He added a handheld GPS, waterproof notebooks, spare batteries, a coiled rope, and a high-resolution camera sealed in a thick plastic housing. As he loaded the gear into his truck, he took care to pack methodically, not because he expected anything dramatic, but because habit had taught him that the wilderness rarely announced its intentions in advance. The drive back to the lake felt longer than usual. Clouds were beginning to gather above the ridges, their shadows sliding across the slopes like slow-moving stains, and the air was heavy with the promise of afternoon storms. The access road, neglected and rutted, forced him to crawl along in low gear, weaving between rocks and fallen branches. At one point, he had to stop to drag a half-rotted log out of the way, the bark disintegrating into damp flakes at his touch. The sense of isolation deepened with every mile. The radio lost its signal, and the only sound inside the cab was the hum of the engine and the faint clatter of gear shifting in the back. When he finally reached the lake, the change from the day before was subtle but unmistakable. The water line had retreated a little farther, revealing a broader band of glistening mud. The oily film still clung to the surface in places, catching the light in thin, iridescent streaks. The smell was stronger now, a faint echo of burnt rubber and old machinery that had no business lingering in a place where the only vehicles were park trucks and the occasional ranger boat. Elias parked near the dock and stood for a moment, taking in the scene with the careful attention he usually reserved for tracking injured wildlife. Every detail seemed to insist that this was not a natural occurrence. He assembled the sonar unit and attached it to a small inflatable raft he carried in the back of the truck for just such surveys. The water was too deep and cold to wade into safely, and the shoreline was too unstable to risk dragging heavier equipment. Inflating the raft took longer than he liked, the pump wheezing with each stroke, but he used the time to steady his breathing and clear his head. By the time he pushed the raft into the lake, the clouds had thickened, muting the sun and turning the water into a sheet of dark glass. Paddling slowly, he guided the raft along a rough grid he had plotted the night before, using landmarks on the shore to keep his bearings. The sonar unit hummed softly as it sent pulses into the depths, the screen flickering with the abstract language of sound waves translated into shapes and shadows. For the first several passes, he saw nothing but the expected contours of the basin, the gradual slope where the quarry walls gave way to the flooded pit, the uneven texture of silt and stone. Then, as he crossed the center of the grid, the display changed. A dense, angular mass appeared on the screen, its edges too sharp to be geological. Elias slowed the raft and circled back, watching as the shape re-emerged from a different angle. The more he adjusted his position, the clearer the outline became. It was not the amorphous blur of debris or the chaotic tangle of a fallen tree. It had straight lines, flat planes, and a profile that made his pulse quicken. He estimated its length and width by the scale on the display and felt a jolt of recognition. Whatever lay below was far larger than a boat or piece of construction equipment. It was the size of a truck. He marked the coordinates with the GPS and repeated the scan, altering the sensitivity and depth range to rule out distortion. The object remained stubbornly consistent, standing upright in a way that made no sense for something that had simply slid into the water by accident. If a vehicle had rolled off the old quarry road, gravity would have sent it tumbling end over end, scattering fragments across the basin. This, by contrast, appeared almost planted, its base embedded in the silt like the root of a metal tree. Elias leaned back in the raft, the paddle resting across his knees, and stared at the shoreline. The faint, nagging discomfort he had felt the day before had grown into a tight knot beneath his ribs. He thought again of the legend about the missing fire engine, of the way the mechanic had lowered his voice when he told it, as if the trees themselves might be listening. He shook off the thought and focused on the practicalities. Official procedure would require him to notify his superiors, submit the data, and wait for authorization to proceed. That could take days, perhaps weeks, and he had already seen how quickly the conditions around the lake were changing. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally announced itself with a distant roll of thunder. The sound echoed through the basin, bouncing off the quarry walls until it was impossible to tell how far away it truly was. Elias checked the sky and calculated how much time he had before the weather turned dangerous. Against his better judgment, he decided to take a closer look. It was not a full dive, not the kind of exploration that would require a team and safety lines, but a cautious descent with a mask and camera, just enough to confirm what the sonar was telling him. He paddled the raft to the coordinates he had marked and secured it to a makeshift anchor, a heavy length of chain he carried for emergencies. The water was colder than he had expected, seeping through his gloves as he tested it with his hand. He fitted the mask over his face, adjusted the straps, and clipped the camera to his wrist. The surface of the lake was deceptively calm, betraying nothing of what waited below. He took a steadying breath and slid over the side. The chill was immediate and bracing, stealing the air from his lungs for a moment before he forced himself to relax. He kicked gently, careful not to disturb the silt more than necessary, and began to descend. The light faded rapidly, the world narrowing to the pale cone of visibility in front of his mask. The water was not clear enough to see far, and within a few yards the surroundings dissolved into murk. He followed the faint guidance of the sonar beacon he had lowered on a line, trusting that it would lead him to the anomaly. As he moved deeper, the temperature dropped further and his breath sounded loud in his ears, a steady rasp that seemed out of place in the thick silence. Then, without warning, something dark loomed in front of him. He slowed, his heart hammering as he drew closer. At first he could not make sense of the shape, only that it was massive and wrong in this context, a block of shadow against shadow. He brushed away a veil of silt with a gloved hand, and the outline sharpened. A rusted grill emerged from the gloom, its vertical bars unmistakable despite the years of corrosion. Above it, the curve of a hood and the edge of a windshield took form, the glass so darkened that it swallowed the light from his torch. Elias felt a surge of adrenaline that had nothing to do with the cold. This was no random piece of scrap. It was a vehicle, old and heavy, standing on the lake bed as if it had been set there deliberately. He swam closer, circling the front end and filming as he went. The sides were coated in a thick layer of algae, but beneath the green he glimpsed faded paint that might once have been a bold color. The tires were half buried, their treads packed with silt. There was no debris field, no scattered parts, only the solitary bulk of the machine, mute and inexplicable. He tried to peer through the windshield, but the blackened glass revealed nothing. The thunder he had heard earlier sounded again, this time closer, reverberating through the water in a way that he felt as much as heard. It was a reminder that he was pushing his luck. Reluctantly, he backed away from the vehicle and followed his line to the surface, lungs burning as he kicked upward. When he broke through into the gray daylight, rain was already beginning to fall, stippling the lake with 1,000 tiny impacts. Back in the truck, wrapped in a dry jacket and clutching a thermos of coffee to chase the chill from his bones, Elias replayed the footage on the camera's small screen. The images were grainy, the light uneven, but the essential truth was there in every frame. A large, vintage truck sat at the bottom of a lake that had no business containing it. The storm intensified, drumming against the roof of the cab, and he realized that whatever lay beneath that water was not going to wait patiently for bureaucratic wheels to turn. He composed his report as soon as he returned to the station, attaching the sonar data, the coordinates, and still images from the dive. He kept his language clinical, describing the anomaly as a large submerged vehicle of indeterminate make and age, positioned upright and partially embedded in silt. He requested authorization for a full recovery operation, citing environmental concerns related to potential contamination. As he hit send, he felt a peculiar mix of satisfaction and apprehension. He had taken the first irreversible step, and even as he shut down his computer and headed home through the rising storm, he knew that the quiet legend he had once dismissed was about to become something far more tangible. The storm that had driven Elias Monroe from the lake did not simply pass through the park. It settled in, draping the ridges in sheets of rain and low cloud for 2 full days, as if the mountains themselves were reluctant to let him return to the place where he had brushed against something long hidden. During that time, he remained in the ranger station, answering routine calls, filling out maintenance logs, and pretending that his mind was not constantly replaying the sonar image of that angular mass resting in the silt. He checked his email obsessively, waiting for a response to the report he had filed, and when it finally arrived late on the second afternoon, it carried with it a mix of relief and apprehension that made his hands tremble slightly as he opened it. Authorization had been granted for a recovery operation. The wording was cautious, framed as an environmental assessment and potential hazard removal, but Elias knew that the implication was far greater. The park administration had contacted the county sheriff, and arrangements were already underway to bring in a heavy lift crane and a salvage team equipped to handle large submerged objects. A date was set for the following morning, weather permitting. The brevity of the message, its refusal to speculate or elaborate, only sharpened the sense that something significant was about to be dragged into the open. By dawn, the storm had broken, leaving the air washed clean and cold. Mist clung to the treetops like unraveling bandages, and the mountains stood revealed in sharp relief against a pale blue sky. Elias drove back to the quarry lake in convoy with a pair of county vehicles. The narrow road suddenly crowded with motion after years of neglect. The farther they went, The more isolated the scene felt, the procession of modern trucks and flashing lights cut in an alien path through the quiet forest. They arrived to find that word had already spread. Despite the early hour, a handful of locals were gathered near the old dock, their vehicles parked haphazardly along the road. Some had come out of curiosity, others with a wary, defensive air that Elias recognized from past encounters when park regulations threatened long-standing habits. He stepped out of his truck and immediately felt the shift in atmosphere, the unspoken tension that had nothing to do with the lake and everything to do with what it might give up. The salvage crew worked with brisk efficiency, unloading equipment from flatbeds and assembling it on the narrow strip of stable ground that bordered the basin. The crane loomed above them, its long arm a stark line against the sky, while generators throbbed and cast a mechanical rhythm over the natural stillness. Elias briefed the team leader, a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face, who listened intently as Elias described the sonar readings and the position of the submerged vehicle. There was no need to embellish. The facts were strange enough on their own. As the crew prepared to attach guidelines and lowering rigs, more people arrived, drawn by rumors that traveled faster than any official announcement. Journalists followed, cameras slung over their shoulders, eager for a story that might fill the empty spaces of the news cycle. Elias felt an uncomfortable spotlight turning toward him, as if he were no longer just a ranger but a gatekeeper to something everyone wanted to see. He stayed focused on the task at hand, reminding himself that his responsibility was to the park, not to the crowd pressing closer with every passing minute. The first divers slipped into the water just as the sun cleared the ridge to the east. The lake looked deceptively peaceful, its surface reflecting the sky in muted blues and grays, but Elias knew how quickly that calm dissolved beneath the surface. He watched as the divers disappeared, their bubbles tracing brief, wavering paths before vanishing into the depths. The waiting that followed was the hardest part. There was nothing for him to do but stand at the edge of the dock, listening to the murmur of the crowd and the distant whine of the crane's motor as it tested its range. When the divers resurfaced, they were followed by a palpable change in the mood of the operation. They conferred with the crew chief in low voices, gesturing toward the water as if describing a puzzle that refused to resolve itself. Elias caught fragments as he moved closer, references to how firmly the object was embedded, to the unusual absence of debris, to the odd orientation that suggested intentional placement rather than accident. He relayed what he knew, adding his own observations from the brief dive he had made days earlier, and together they formulated a plan to secure the vehicle with slings and gradually coax it free of the silt. The process was painstaking. The first attempt at lifting resulted in little more than a shudder that rippled across the surface of the lake, as if something below were shrugging off the effort. The second drew a plume of dark mud that boiled up like smoke, obscuring the divers and forcing a temporary halt. The crowd grew restless, some people calling out suggestions, others speculating loudly about what lay beneath the water. Elias felt a prickle of irritation at the spectacle the operation was becoming, but he knew there was no stopping it now. Finally, after the divers adjusted their rigging and the crane operator applied a steady, measured pull, the lake yielded. The surface bulged and then broke, disgorging a mass so dark and indistinct that for a moment it looked like a fragment of the mountain itself rising to greet the sky. Water cascaded from it in sheets, carrying with it strands of algae and clumps of silt that spattered onto the dock and the waiting machinery. As the shape cleared the surface, its outline sharpened, and a collective intake of breath rippled through the onlookers. It was a truck, unmistakably so, its bulky silhouette framed against the forest. Age had gnawed at it relentlessly, turning paint to scabrous flakes and metal to lacework in places, but the basic form remained. Elias recognized the curve of the hood and the tall, squared-off cab from the footage he had reviewed, but seeing it in the open air was something else entirely. The vehicle hung from the crane like a relic dredged from another century, dripping lake water that pooled on the ground in oily puddles. As the crew guided it onto a flatbed prepared for the purpose, Elias noticed details that had been impossible to discern underwater. The windows were coated in a film so dark it was almost opaque, a charred look that made the interior invisible. The doors, streaked with rust and grime, appeared warped, their frames twisted just enough to suggest that opening them would be a challenge. The front grille, half consumed by corrosion, still bore the ghost of a manufacturer's emblem, though the letters were long gone. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the tangible proof that something extraordinary had been hidden beneath the lake for decades. Elias felt a flicker of unease as he took in their faces. Some were lit with excitement, others with apprehension, and a few with something harder to define, a guarded wariness that hinted at private calculations. He made a mental note of it even as he turned his attention back to the vehicle. This was no longer just a matter of environmental safety. Whatever secrets were locked inside that rusted shell had the power to disturb more than sediment. Before any attempt was made to force the doors, the sheriff insisted on a preliminary inspection. He and Elias circled the truck together, the sheriff's practiced eye taking in the anomalies that leapt out now that the machine was no longer cloaked in darkness. He tapped the side panel with a knuckle and frowned at the hollow sound it made, far more resonant than expected. Elias felt the echo of his own unease in that simple gesture. A vehicle of this size and era should have been dense with machinery, its weight and solidity unmistakable. Instead, it felt oddly insubstantial, like a stage prop masquerading as something real. As the crew prepared hydraulic tools to breach the stubborn driver's door, Elias stepped back, aware of the cameras angling for a clear shot. He thought of the report he had written, the cautious phrasing that now seemed almost laughably inadequate to capture the reality of what stood before him. He thought of the storm that had driven him away and the way the lake had seemed to hold its breath until he returned. And, as the metal frame began to creak under the pressure of the spreader, he felt the first true certainty that whatever they were about to uncover would not simply answer questions. It would create them, rippling outward from this forgotten basin into the lives of people who had never imagined that the wilderness could carry such a deliberate, human-made lie within its depths. The metal gave way with a shriek that cut through the murmurs of the crowd and the steady drone of generators. The hydraulic spreader bit into the corroded seam of the driver's door, forcing it outward millimeter by stubborn millimeter until the warped frame surrendered with a sound like tearing cloth magnified 100 times. Elias Monroe stood just behind the sheriff, close enough to feel the vibration of the tool travel through the steel shell, and in that instant, before the door finally gaped open, he had the uncanny sensation of crossing a threshold, not just in space, but in time. The smell that drifted out was not the stale rot he had half expected, not the trapped odor of waterlogged upholstery or decaying insulation. Instead, it was dry and faintly metallic, tinged with the ghost of oil that had long since evaporated. When the door was pried wide enough to peer inside, a beam of light speared into the cab and fell on emptiness. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The interior, that should have been crowded with the bulky anatomy of a mid-century fire engine, was stripped to bare metal ribs. The steering column ended in a jagged stump. The dashboard was gone, leaving only a rectangular void where instruments once crowded together. There were no seats, no pedals, no trace of wiring or hoses, nothing but the echoing hollowness of a shell that had been carefully flayed. The sheriff leaned in, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to something approaching disbelief. He ran a gloved hand along the exposed floor, tracing lines where components had once been bolted down. The marks were clean, too clean, free of the chaotic scars left by disaster. Elias felt a cold wave of comprehension wash over him. This was not the result of a crash or a fire or years of neglect beneath the water. It was the residue of intent. The crew began to document the interior with the methodical precision of people who sense the importance of every detail. Photographs were taken from multiple angles, measurements recorded, fragments of loose material collected in evidence bags. Elias found himself drawn into the empty cab despite the knot of unease in his chest. He stepped onto the flatbed and leaned closer, the darkened windows swallowing the light from the flood lamps. The glass was coated in a black film that resisted his touch. Not soot exactly, but something that seemed to have been applied. A deliberate veil to hide what lay beyond when the truck still moved through the world above ground. As they moved to the rear compartments, the pattern repeated itself with grim consistency. Where heavy pumps and brass fittings should have been mounted, there were only outlines, pale ghosts of metal against darker paint. The bolts had been removed, not snapped. The cuts where hoses and cables had been detached were smooth, almost surgical. Elias cataloged these details in his mind even as the crowd pressed closer, their whispers rising to a fevered pitch. This was no longer a relic salvaged from the past. It was a message, though one whose author had long since vanished. The sheriff straightened and met Elias's gaze. In that look, there was an unspoken acknowledgement that the story they had all expected to tell, of a tragic accident and a lost vehicle finally brought to light, had just been obliterated. What stood before them was not a tomb, but a riddle. He ordered the area secured, his voice cutting through the growing noise, and uniformed deputies moved to establish a perimeter. A few disgruntled locals protested, but their complaints fell flat in the face of the unfolding spectacle. Elias retreated a step, feeling suddenly exposed in the midst of the attention he had unwittingly drawn. Cameras flashed, their sharp clicks like the snapping of insect wings, and reporters began speaking urgently into phones. He knew that by nightfall the images would be everywhere, the empty carcass of the truck framed as the latest mystery in a region that had grown accustomed to being ignored. Yet, even as the narrative began to take shape beyond his control, he found his thoughts turning inward to the small details that the broader audience would miss. He noticed, for instance, that the pattern of corrosion inside the cab differed from that on the exterior. The metal ribs within were less eaten away, suggesting that the interior had been exposed to water for a shorter time than the outer shell. That alone contradicted any notion that the truck had simply been dumped intact decades ago. It implied a period of exposure to air after it had been stripped, long enough for the inside to begin oxidizing, but not so long that the elements could erase the marks of disassembly. There were other subtleties. A scrap of cloth snagged on a jagged edge where the dashboard had once been mounted, its fibers bleached but still distinct, perhaps a remnant of a work shirt or a cleaning rag. A length of frayed twine caught beneath the rear frame, too insubstantial to have survived a violent crash, but perfectly placed to be forgotten in the rush of deliberate work. Elias collected these small fragments with the care of someone handling something fragile and irreplaceable, even as part of him wondered whether they were clues or merely artifacts of a process he could only begin to imagine. The representatives from the county arrived not long after, their polished shoes sinking into the mud around the lake as they approached the truck with thinly veiled apprehension. They spoke in low, controlled tones to the sheriff, their eyes flicking repeatedly to the onlookers and the camera lenses trained on them. Elias watched their body language with a growing sense of disquiet. These were not the reactions of officials confronted with an unfortunate environmental hazard. They were the reactions of people who understood that a long-accepted version of events was about to be questioned. One of them suggested, in a voice meant to be reassuring, that the vehicle was likely nothing more than a stripped piece of scrap, abandoned when the quarry closed. The explanation rang hollow even as it was offered. Elias felt a flicker of anger at the attempt to minimize what lay plainly before them. He responded carefully, citing the absence of any record of authorized dumping in the area and the unmistakable signs of systematic disassembly. He could feel the weight of scrutiny settle on him in that moment, the subtle shift from collaborator to potential irritant. The crowd began to thin as the afternoon wore on, some drawn away by obligations, others by the disappointment of not having witnessed a sensational reveal of human remains. In their wake, the quiet returned, tentative at first, then more insistent as the park reasserted its presence. The truck remained where it was, shrouded in tarps and guarded by deputies, a hulking question mark in the clearing. Elias stood apart from the activity, jotting down observations that went beyond his official duties, knowing that the answers would not be found in press releases or superficial inspections. When the operation finally wound down for the day, the lake had slipped back into shadow, the setting sun gilding its surface with fleeting color. Elias lingered, reluctant to leave the place that had become the axis of a story far larger than he had anticipated. He thought again of the mechanic's hushed legend, of the way some of the locals had looked at him as if he were disturbing a grave that did not belong to him. The difference now was that the grave was empty, and emptiness has a way of demanding to be filled with truth. As he drove away, the image of the hollow cab followed him, its dark windows like blind eyes turned toward the forest. He did not yet know how far the ripples would travel, only that they had begun here, with the tearing of metal and the revelation of a void where the beating heart of a machine should have been. Whatever had been done to that fire engine, it had been done by human hands with a purpose that the wilderness had neither condoned nor forgotten. And Elias Monroe, ranger of a park that prided itself on preserving the natural order, now found himself at the center of an unraveling that had nothing to do with nature at all. The hollow truck did not leave Elias Monroe's thoughts when he returned home that evening. Even the quiet of his cabin, usually a refuge after long days in the field, felt strangely inadequate, as though the emptiness he had seen inside the rusted fire engine had followed him back through the trees and taken up residence in the corners of his mind. He sat at his small kitchen table long after dark, files spread out before him, the low lamp casting a tired yellow circle over documents that had not been touched in decades. If the answers were not inside the metal shell, then they had to be somewhere else, buried in ink and forgotten signatures. He began with the park archives. The next morning, he requested access to the oldest storage room beneath the main ranger building, a place most of the staff regarded as little more than a graveyard for outdated regulations and yellowed maps. The room smelled of dust and cardboard and something faintly chemical, a residue from the cleaning agents used long ago. He pulled open drawers that had not slid smoothly in years and flipped through brittle folders labeled with fading handwriting. Fire reports from the 1960s were stacked in uneven bundles, their pages peppered with small burn marks from cigarettes smoked by men who had long since retired or died. The year he needed lay somewhere near the bottom of a metal filing cabinet whose paint was flaking in strips. He found it eventually, a thick binder stamped with the insignia of a state forestry agency that no longer existed under that name. As he leafed through the pages, the official version of events took shape in the language of the time, dense and formal, laden with assurances that every effort had been made to contain a catastrophic blaze that had swept across the eastern slopes of the park. One section described the loss of a fire engine in a remote sector, crushed beyond recovery by a sudden landslide. It was a neat narrative, cleanly bounded by bureaucratic phrasing, but Elias felt its seams almost immediately. The coordinates given for the supposed landslide did not correspond to any known slide path in the region, and the accompanying maps were vague to the point of uselessness. More troubling was the absence of detail about the crew assigned to the engine. Names appeared in one document, only to vanish in the next. A handwritten margin note questioned whether all personnel had been accounted for, but the question was never answered. It was as if the record itself hesitated, then chose to forget. From the park archives, he moved on to local newspapers, scrolling through microfilm in the small library that served the surrounding communities. The headlines from that summer were dramatic, heavy with talk of heroism and sacrifice, yet curiously light on verifiable facts. Articles spoke of a valiant crew lost to the fury of the mountains, but no photographs of the scene accompanied the prose, no eyewitness accounts from fellow firefighters who might have stood nearby. Fundraisers were announced, memorial services planned, and within weeks the town council approved an emergency budget to replace the destroyed equipment. The story hardened into legend almost overnight, and Elias could see how easily a comforting myth could take root in a place where tragedy was a familiar visitor. He began to cross-reference these public narratives with the internal documents he had uncovered. The discrepancies multiplied. The date of the engine's disappearance shifted subtly between sources, sometimes by a matter of days, sometimes by weeks. One report listed the engine as having been dispatched from a station miles away from where another claimed it had originated. A particularly unsettling memo, buried deep in a folder labeled Miscellaneous Correspondence, mentioned the possibility of mechanical failure prior to the incident, a suggestion that was never again addressed. Money left its own paper trail, and Elias followed it next. He requested records of insurance claims and emergency appropriations from the county office, presenting his inquiry as part of an ongoing investigation into environmental contamination. The clerks, more accustomed to dealing with zoning permits and property tax disputes, seemed bemused by his interest in half-century-old transactions, but they complied. Over the course of several hours, he pored over ledger sheets that told a story in columns of numbers. There it was, a sizable payout authorized in the aftermath of the fire, designated for the replacement of Engine 9, a vehicle now widely believed to have met its end in a landslide that might never have existed. What struck him was not the amount itself, though it was substantial for the era, but the speed with which it had been approved. There were no lengthy appeals, no contested valuations, only a smooth, efficient flow of funds from insurer to municipality. In the months that followed, additional grants were awarded for equipment upgrades, training programs, even the construction of a small memorial near the town square. It was as if the loss of the engine had become a catalyst for prosperity, a sorrow that paid dividends. Elias sat back from the microfilm reader and closed his eyes, the hum of the machine lingering in his ears. He imagined the families of the firefighters receiving news filtered through layers of official rhetoric, told to be proud even as their questions were deflected. He found their names in obituaries and wedding announcements, glimpses of ordinary lives interrupted by a story too grand and too vague to challenge. One widow had moved away within a year, her absence noted only in the shifting of a line in the local directory. Another family appeared to have dissolved, siblings scattering to distant states, their shared history reduced to a footnote in the town's collective memory. The deeper he dug, the more Elias felt the weight of what had been taken from them, not only in terms of truth, but in the subtle theft of closure. The legend of the lost engine had offered comfort, a narrative of noble sacrifice that allowed grief to be packaged and stored away. To question it now, after so many years, felt like reopening wounds that had never truly healed. Yet the evidence was too insistent to ignore. He found a memo from a regional equipment supplier noting an unusually large order for spare parts placed shortly before the fire, including components identical to those missing from the submerged truck. The parts were marked as delivered, but the receiving signatures were illegible, the ink smeared as if someone had signed in haste. The coincidence was impossible to dismiss. By the time he left the library that evening, the sun had dipped low behind the hills, painting the sky in muted shades of orange and purple. Elias paused on the steps, looking out at the quiet street that had borne the weight of these secrets for so long. Children rode bicycles past storefronts that bore the same names they had 50 years ago. People greeted one another with easy familiarity, unaware that the story they had inherited might be built on a foundation of calculated deceit. He returned to his cabin with a folder thick with copies and notes, his mind buzzing with connections that refused to settle into a single, tidy conclusion. The hollow fire engine, the rushed insurance payout, the missing details in the archives, the sudden influx of funds that had reshaped the town's fortunes. Each piece on its own might have been explained away. Together, they formed a pattern that was beginning to feel disturbingly deliberate. Late that night, he spread the documents across his table once more, the same lamp illuminating a far more troubling landscape than it had the evening before. He traced lines between names and dates, letting the fragments coalesce into a narrative that no official report had ever dared to tell. The truck had not been lost to the mountains. It had been unmade by human hands, its valuable parts stripped away while a convenient tragedy was crafted to fill the void. As he finally turned in for the night, exhaustion pressing down on him like the weight of the forest itself, Elias understood that the empty shell resting by the quarry lake was only the most visible symptom of a sickness that had spread through the town long before he arrived in the park. The wilderness had kept the secret for as long as it could, but now, with the water receding and the metal exposed to the light, it had passed the burden on to him. The idea that the empty fire engine had been stripped somewhere on dry land before its silent descent into the quarry lake refused to leave Elias Monroe's thoughts after he closed the folder of archival documents. The wilderness had not done this. People had, and they had done it close enough to leave behind a trail, however faint. He returned to the lake early the next morning, not with sonar or dive gear this time, but with old maps spread across the hood of his truck, tracing the lines of a place that had been reshaped beyond recognition. Long before the pit filled with water, the quarry had been a hive of activity. Elias unearthed a set of hand-drawn plans from the county planning office that depicted the site in its industrial heyday. There were access roads now swallowed by forest, loading platforms that had collapsed into the basin, and a sprawling service yard that once held crushers, generators, and repair sheds. The map was annotated with names of contractors whose companies had vanished or rebranded in the decades since, but the surnames themselves echoed those he had begun to associate with the strange flow of money after the fire. He drove slowly along what had once been the quarry's main access road, the route now little more than a depression in the earth that only someone who knew to look could follow. Moss had softened the ruts, and saplings pushed up through the gravel like stubborn memories. At the edge of the lake, he found the remains of a concrete foundation, its corners buried under leaf litter and pine needles. This, he realized, had likely been the location of a maintenance building, a place where heavy equipment could be serviced away from prying eyes. Elias knelt and brushed aside debris, exposing a length of rusted rail that curved in a shallow arc. It took him a moment to understand what he was seeing. It was part of a track system, the kind used to guide vehicles or machinery into position. He imagined the fire engine rolling slowly along those rails, its valuable components removed one by one in the shelter of a building that no longer stood. The image was unsettling not because of its violence, but because of its banality. There was nothing dramatic about the act of dismantling a truck. It was labor, plain and methodical, carried out by people who had likely gone home to dinner afterward without a second thought. From the site, he followed the paper trail outward, away from the park and into the broader world of commerce where objects lost their stories and became inventory. He contacted collectors and restoration specialists who dealt in vintage firefighting equipment, posing as a ranger seeking information about historical models. Some were guarded, suspicious of his motives, but others were eager to talk, their voices brightening at the chance to share obscure knowledge. He learned about the distinctive brass pumps manufactured for a brief window in the early 1960s, about the serial numbering conventions that had been abandoned when companies merged or closed. These were the parts that had vanished from the lake, the gleaming heart of a machine reduced to a shell. One afternoon, he received an email from a restorer in another state who had come across a peculiar lot at an auction years earlier. The items had been listed as surplus, sold without provenance, but the restorer remembered them because of their unusual configuration. He attached photographs, and when Elias opened them he felt the same jolt of recognition he had experienced beneath the water. The fittings bore the same mounting pattern he had documented on the empty truck, the same telltale spacing between bolt holes. Even the discoloration along the edges matched the marks left on the fire engine's frame, as though the metal itself had carried an imprint of its former attachment. Elias printed the images and pinned them to a corkboard beside his growing collection of notes. The web was tightening. He reached out to the auction house that had handled the sale, presenting his inquiry as part of a historical research project. Their records were incomplete, many of the older files lost in a fire or purged during a transition to digital systems, but one ledger survived in a storage unit that had been overlooked. It listed the consignor of the lot as a defunct contracting firm whose name had appeared on the quarry maps he had studied. The coincidence was too precise to dismiss. He arranged to have an expert examine the components from the restorer's collection, and the verdict was unequivocal. The parts were not generic replacements. They had been custom-fitted for a specific engine, down to minor manufacturing quirks that only appeared in a limited production run. The expert's report concluded that the likelihood of them originating from any other vehicle was vanishingly small. As Elias assembled this evidence, a subtle shift began to take place around him. It was not dramatic, not the overt threats or confrontations that populated television dramas, but something quieter and more insidious. He found the tires on his truck inexplicably low one morning, the valve caps missing. Another day, he discovered that a file he had left on his desk had been moved, the papers rearranged in a way that suggested curious hands had leafed through them. When he mentioned the incidents to a colleague, he was met with a strained smile and a suggestion that he was letting the case get to him. The reaction of the town grew more complicated as rumors filtered back from the county offices and the press. Some residents approached him with cautious gratitude, sharing half-remembered stories about equipment sales that had never made sense, or about council meetings that had ended abruptly when questions were raised. Others avoided him entirely, crossing the street when they saw him coming or breaking off conversations mid-sentence. A few were less subtle, muttering about stirring up trouble or destroying a legacy that had sustained the community through lean years. Elias took these reactions as a measure of how close he was getting. He continued to document everything, backing up files and making copies of reports that he stored in different locations. He knew enough about the fragility of truth in the face of institutional inertia to guard against complacency. The wilderness had held its silence for decades, but now that it had begun to speak, there were forces that would prefer it to fall quiet once more. One evening, as he was reviewing the expert's analysis at his cabin, he noticed a vehicle idling at the edge of his property. Its headlights remained off, the shape barely discernible among the trees. It stayed there for several minutes before turning around and disappearing back down the dirt road. Elias sat very still, the glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The message was not overt, but it did not need to be. Someone wanted him to know that he was being watched. He did not waver. If anything, the sense of pressure sharpened his resolve. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together too cleanly now to allow doubt. The quarry, the stripped engine, the vanished brass pumps, the convenient tragedy that had paved the way for an influx of money. It was all part of a single narrative that had been written in the margins of official history and then forgotten by those who stood to benefit most. When he finally closed his laptop and looked out the window at the dark sweep of forest, Elias felt a curious calm settle over him. He had spent his career preserving a landscape shaped by forces far older than any human scheme. Now he was confronted with a different kind of erosion, one that gnawed at trust and memory rather than stone. The wilderness had given him its clue in the form of a hollow machine, and he had followed it as far as it would go. What remained was to bring that story into the light, regardless of who might prefer it to remain buried. By the time Elias Monroe stood before the assembled investigators, attorneys, and county officials, the story he had been piecing together for weeks had taken on a coherence that was at once satisfying and deeply unsettling. The fragments he had chased through forgotten archives, rusted foundations, auction ledgers, and whispered local anecdotes had aligned into a pattern too deliberate to be the product of chance. He felt the weight of that pattern as he laid out the chronology in a conference room that smelled faintly of floor polish and old coffee. The windows shuttered against the press that waited outside. He began at the quarry, at the maintenance building that no longer existed except as a scar in the earth. There, he explained, the fire engine had been taken after the blaze that officially marked its disappearance. Not to be mourned, not to be buried by a landslide, but to be dismantled piece by valuable piece. The distinctive brass pumps that collectors coveted, the motor that could be sold as surplus, even the wiring and fixtures that would fetch a modest price. It was not a frantic stripping carried out in the panic of disaster. It was a systematic operation, planned and executed by people who knew exactly what they were doing and how to conceal it. As he spoke, Elias watched faces around the table change. Some displayed disbelief that hardened into wary interest, others a flicker of recognition that they tried and failed to hide. He detailed how the parts had moved from the quarry into the world of auctions and restorations, their origins obscured by paperwork that bore only the most generic descriptions. The report from the expert lay before him, its technical language a bulwark against accusations of speculation. These were not random components. They were the heart of Engine 9, scattered across private collections and repair shops under the guise of legitimate trade. The scheme, as he reconstructed it, had required more than a handful of opportunists. It demanded cooperation from those who could smooth the path of insurance claims and municipal budgets. In the aftermath of the fire, when the town was primed for sympathy and aid, the story of a heroic loss had been shaped and circulated with remarkable efficiency. Reports were written, maps altered, and questions redirected until the narrative of a landslide had settled into public consciousness like a geological fact. The empty shell of the engine, stripped of anything that might raise suspicion, was then taken back to the quarry and lowered into the water that would soon become a lake, the final act of a deception designed to be permanent. There was a pause when Elias reached that point, a hush in which the room seemed to hold its breath. He had expected objections, counter-arguments, some attempt to fracture the chain of reasoning he had built, but instead he was met with a heavy silence. It was broken at last by the chief investigator, a woman with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She asked him to repeat the details about the insurance payout and the emergency appropriations, her tone measured but edged with something like anger. He did so, and in that repetition the emotional core of the story came into sharper focus. The fire engine had not simply vanished. It had been converted into capital, its disassembly a prelude to the infusion of money that reshaped the town's fortunes. Grants that were never audited properly, memorial funds that masked the absence of real accountability, all built on a foundation of deliberate misrepresentation. It was corruption not of the flamboyant, headline-grabbing kind, but of the quiet, corrosive variety that thrived on trust and complacency. The discussion turned to the crew that had been assigned to Engine 9. Here, the narrative grew darker still. Officially, they had been listed as lost in the same landslide that destroyed their vehicle, their remains unrecovered but their sacrifice enshrined in ceremony. Yet the documents Elias had uncovered told a different story, one riddled with erasures and ambiguities. The men's names appeared and disappeared across records, their fates never described with the finality one would expect of confirmed deaths. It was as though they had been edited out of existence, their absence papered over by patriotic rhetoric. This was the point at which Elias felt the weight of what he was asking the room to confront. If the engine had never been lost to a landslide, if it had been dismantled in cold deliberation, then what had become of the people who were supposed to have been inside it? He did not accuse anyone of murder. He did not need to. The mere suggestion that these men might not have perished in the manner claimed, that their disappearance had been convenient for those who profited from the scheme, was enough to chill the air. Outside, the press had begun to piece together fragments of the story, their speculation audible even through the closed doors. Inside, the investigators conferred in low voices, already outlining the next steps. Subpoenas would be issued, bank records scrutinized, interviews conducted with anyone still alive who had been involved in the aftermath of the fire. The web Elias had traced was about to be tested by the full force of the law, and he could not predict how many strands would snap under that strain. When the meeting finally adjourned, he stepped into the corridor feeling both lighter and more exposed than he had in weeks. He had done what he set out to do, carrying the truth as far as he could on his own. Now it belonged to others, to institutions whose response would determine whether the story ended in justice or simply another layer of official forgetfulness. A reporter called out his name, her voice sharp with urgency, but he kept walking, unwilling to be drawn into the simplified narratives that were already taking shape. As he drove back toward the park, the familiar contours of the mountains offered a strange comfort. Whatever the outcome of the investigation, whatever backlash he might face from those who felt threatened by it, he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The hollow fire engine by the quarry lake was no longer a curiosity. It was evidence, a mute witness to a scheme that had thrived in darkness for more than half a century. He did not know whether the truth would restore anything that had been lost. He only knew that the land itself seemed to breathe easier, now that its burden was being shared. The water would continue to recede and rise with the seasons, indifferent to human affairs, but the lie that had settled into its depths had been dragged into the light at last. The first snow of the season fell on the day the families of the long-lost firefighters gathered in the small courthouse at the edge of town. It came down softly, as if the sky were reluctant to intrude on what was about to happen inside, settling on roofs and branches in a pale hush that seemed to mute the world beyond the tall windows. Elias Monroe arrived early, standing in the hallway with his coat unbuttoned, watching as people filtered in, their faces drawn with anticipation and a kind of weary hope that had been tempered by decades of unanswered questions. They had been invited under the neutral banner of an informational briefing, but everyone in the room understood that it was more than that. It was the first time since the summer of the Great Fire that officials had asked them to come together not to mourn, not to commemorate, but to listen. Elias recognized several names from the yellowed obituaries and brittle clippings he had pored over in the library. Now, those names were attached to aging men and women who carried the weight of those years in the lines around their eyes, and the careful way they moved, as if afraid to disturb whatever fragile equilibrium they had managed to build around their grief. The chief investigator spoke first, her voice steady and deliberate as she outlined the findings that had emerged from months of scrutiny. There was no melodrama in her delivery, no rhetorical flourish. She spoke of altered reports, of insurance payouts that should have raised alarms, of equipment traced across state lines to private collections and workshops. Then she addressed the heart of the matter, the thing that had been avoided in public discourse for more than half a century. The fire engine had not been lost in a landslide. It had been dismantled deliberately, its most valuable components sold under the table, its empty shell hidden in a quarry pit that would soon fill with water and bury the evidence. The room was silent as the words settled. Some people stared at the table in front of them as if trying to anchor themselves to something solid. Others closed their eyes. A woman in the front row gripped her purse so tightly that her knuckles went white, the leather creaking softly in protest. Elias felt his throat tighten, a reaction that surprised him even after all he had learned. These were not just facts he had assembled. They were lives that had been bent and twisted around a lie. When the investigator turned to the question of the missing firefighters, her tone shifted almost imperceptibly. Official records, she explained, had never conclusively documented their deaths. There were inconsistencies that could not be reconciled with the narrative the town had accepted. It was possible, though not yet proven, that some of the men assigned to Engine 9 had survived the fire itself, only to disappear into a fog of altered paperwork and convenient assumptions. The investigation was ongoing, and any conclusions would have to wait for further evidence, but the implication was clear. The story that had been told about these men was at best incomplete and, at worst, a deliberate fabrication. For a long moment after she finished, no one spoke. The silence felt heavier than any outburst might have been, pressing down on the room with the force of all the years that had passed since that summer. Then someone began to cry, quietly at first, a sound that spread like a fissure through stone until it was impossible to tell where one person's grief ended and another's began. Elias stood apart, his hands clasped behind his back, unsure whether he had any right to be there at all. He had carried the truth this far, but now it belonged to those who had paid the price for its absence. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blurring the edges of the town in a way that seemed almost merciful. The old memorial in the square, a simple slab of granite etched with names and dates, was already gathering a white mantle that softened its sharp lines. In the weeks that followed, that monument would become the focus of fierce debate. Some argued that it should be torn down, that it was nothing but a monument to a lie. Others insisted that it remain, but with a new plaque that told the fuller story, the story that had been hidden for so long. The decision, when it finally came, reflected the uneasy compromise that marked so many of the town's choices. The original stone would stay, its weathered face a testament to the passage of time, but beside it a new installation would rise, one that no one could mistake for a comforting fiction. The hollow fire engine, hauled from the quarry lake and cleaned of its thickest layers of silt, would be placed on a concrete pad at the edge of the park, its empty interior visible through cutaway panels. An accompanying display would explain what had been taken from it and why, tracing the path from that quiet dismantling to the reshaping of a town's fortunes. On the morning the shell was set in place, Elias stood with a small crowd at the edge of the clearing. The truck looked even more forlorn in daylight, its rusted frame stark against the fresh snow. People approached it hesitantly, peering inside as if expecting to find something more than the stark reality of absence. Children asked their parents why it was empty, and for once there were no easy answers, no heroic gloss to smooth the edges of the truth. For Elias, the installation was not a triumph, but a reckoning. He watched as families laid flowers at the base of the display, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement of a grief that had been postponed for too long. He spoke quietly with a man who had been a boy when the fire raged through the mountains, who had grown up believing that his father's death was a simple, tragic fact of life. Now, that belief had been stripped away, leaving behind a complicated blend of anger and relief that no memorial could fully address. In the months that followed, the investigation wound its way through courts and committee rooms, exposing a network of small betrayals that added up to a profound one. Some of the men who had signed off on the altered reports were gone, their names surviving only in the margins of old documents, but others were forced to answer for their actions at last. The process was slow and often unsatisfying, constrained by statutes of limitation and the erosion of evidence, yet it carried a symbolic weight that Elias felt keenly. The truth, even when it arrived too late to heal old wounds, still mattered. Life in the park gradually returned to its familiar rhythms. The lake froze over in winter and thawed again in spring, its dark surface no longer hiding a secret that no one dared to name. Visitors came to see the strange relic at the edge of the forest, some drawn by curiosity, others by a more solemn desire to understand how such a story could unfold in a place devoted to preservation and transparency. Elias continued his patrols, his days filled once more with the practical concerns of erosion control and trail maintenance, but he carried with him a changed perspective. He had always believed that his duty was to protect the land, to keep it as untouched as possible for those who would come after him. Now, he understood that stewardship also meant guarding the stories that clung to that land, the invisible layers of human action that shaped its present as surely as glaciers and floods. The wilderness, he realized, was not just a refuge from history, but a repository of it, holding within its depths both the beauty and the failures of those who had passed through. On a quiet afternoon toward the end of the year, Elias walked alone to the lake. The snow had melted along the shore, revealing the familiar band of gray mud where he had first noticed the tire tracks months before. He stood for a long time at the water's edge, listening to the wind move through the trees and watching ripples disturb the mirror of the surface. The place felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a pressure had been released. He knew that not everyone would thank him for what he had uncovered. There would always be those who preferred the simplicity of a myth to the complexity of truth. Yet, as he turned back toward the forest and the long road home, he felt a quiet certainty settle within him. He had done what the land itself had asked of him, bringing to light something that had been buried not by time, but by intent. In a career measured by countless small acts of care, this one would stand apart, a reminder that even the deepest silence can be broken if someone is willing to listen long enough. Before you go, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next story, because the secrets hidden beneath the surface are only just beginning to surface. Watch the next video now to uncover another unbelievable discovery. And if this story shocked you, share it with someone who loves real mysteries as much as you do.